So I think it's really important to talk with young people about atheism, because atheism is a great way to discuss what we really mean when we're talking about God. And one of my favorite modern day atheists is a man named Sam Harris. Harris has written three books: Letter to a Christian Nation, The End of Faith, and his newest book, The Moral Landscape. And Harris also has a lot of videos on YouTube that explains his position, and we watched one of his videos, which is called Why I Criticize Religion. And I'm just going to show you a few clips from it, and it will help us to discover what Christians mean when we talk about God. So in this first clip, Harris says a lot about why he got interested in religion, which was the violence that occurred on 9/11.
The rather obvious liability of religious certainty was made extraordinarily clear on that day. I mean, we were having people flying planes into our buildings for explicitly religious reasons. But what was also made clear is that we were going to deny the religious rationale because of our own attachment to our own religious myths. I mean, the only language we could find as a culture to comfort ourselves was to endorse our own God talk. So I suddenly saw faith playing both sides of the board in a very dangerous game, where we as a nation, in prosecuting our war on terror, which was obviously a necessary thing to do, though calling it a war on terror I think is rather silly, but we were consoling ourselves with our own religious certainties, very much in the language of Christian fundamentalism. The president comes before Congress and talks about God not being indifferent to freedom and fear. As an atheist, I hear that exactly the way I would hear someone saying Zeus is not indifferent to freedom and fear.
Harris's interest in religion stemmed from 9/11, and he is absolutely correct to critique those horrendously violent acts. The problem that I have with Harris's argument here is when he says that it was necessary for us to prosecute the war on terror. Why? He doesn't really say, but I would imagine that he would allude to something like, in the name of goodness, in the name of justice, in the name of security and freedom, we must strike them back, in those, alluding to those themes. The problem is that everybody has justifications for violence. So these people who committed this act would justify them in the name of God, yes, but also in the name of other transcendent ideals, such as goodness, such as justice, such as the security of their own lives. They feel like the Western world is encroaching on their way of life, and the only way that they know how to resort back is to necessarily act in violence. So our justifications for violence end up looking a lot alike. Now, the second issue that I have with his argument comes at the end of this clip, and that's when he critiques George Bush for alluding to God in one of his speeches, and that sounds a lot like Zeus. The problem is that the Christian understanding of God is not this Zeus figure who's way up out here manipulating events down here, but it looks like Jesus. All of the early Christians say that God looks like Jesus. When Mark says that Jesus is the Messiah, he's the one who represents God. When John says that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus is the one who represents God, not this Zeus figure way up here. Now, in our next clip, Harris will interestingly point to Jesus, and let's take a look here.
I mean, I take very seriously the possibility of experiencing the world the way Buddha and Jesus and other famous patriarchs and matriarchs seem to have experienced the world. And I think we want to actualize that kind of experience. I mean, if it's possible to love your neighbor as yourself, I'm interested in learning how to do that. I just don't think we have to believe anything on insufficient evidence in order to do that.
So I think that Harris is exactly right to say that if we can actualize love of neighbor, we should do so in the way that Jesus did and in the way that the Buddha did. The problem is at the end when he says that we just shouldn't have to believe something with insufficient evidence in order to do so. And the reason that I have a problem with this is because if we don't believe that there's something transcendent that calls us to love our neighbors as ourselves, then we're going to make this about us. The Buddha saw that all of life was interconnected, and so he didn't want to hurt anything. He gave up his desires for violence. Jesus saw God, the ultimate principle of all of the world, as love. These are transcendent aspects that see the world and human beings as interconnected, and the way that you respond to that interconnectedness is through love. If you don't think that that comes from something transcendent, you make it about your ego. And then we revert back to justifications for violence against our neighbor, and we fail to love our neighbor. Now, here in this last clip, Harris will talk about God being this sadistic thing that likes to see pain in the world, and we'll see how that's not the Christian God.
What this almighty sadist in the sky wants human beings to do while alive, and it's a proposition for which there really is no good evidence.
Here we see that Harris accuses God of being the almighty sadist in the sky. The problem with this for Christians is that if we really believe that God is revealed through this person, Jesus, then God is nothing like an almighty sadist in the sky. Rather, humans are like this mighty sadist who want to see suffering and violence inflicted upon another. And Harris even falls into this trap, because remember, he says violence is sometimes necessary. Jesus reveals that for God, violence is never necessary. Rather, what Jesus reveals is that God takes all of this human sadistic violence upon God's self and offers forgiveness in return. You see this on the cross. Jesus lives his life forgiving people and healing people who are sick, bringing people who have been scapegoated, marginalized, back into a loving community. And after the cross, when Jesus dies, he's resurrected, and he offers peace to those who have betrayed. What human being does this? You can't make this up. If I'm making up stories about God, my God is going to look an awful lot like Zeus, because that God will help me in my justifications for violence. But what Jesus does is says God has nothing to do with violence. Humans have everything to do with violence. And Jesus invites us to transform into this way of love that Harris is talking about. But we can't do it by ourselves, because if we try to do it by ourselves, we will make it about us and we'll revert back to justifications for violence. The only way we can love our neighbor as ourselves is through the God who is love. So those are my thoughts on atheism, Sam Harris, and Christianity. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks.